So before we talk about white blood cells, we'll talk about a couple more things with red blood cells. One of those being sickle cell anemia. And previously, we described sickle cell anemia as a genetic disorder that causes a problem with one of the globin chains of hemoglobin, and that results from just one change to the 3 billion pairs of nucleotides that make up the human genome, as you can see here. What that will cause is when hemoglobin in a sickle cell anemia person binds oxygen, it causes these sickle-shaped cells that occlude or block blood vessels. Now on the right here, you can see the Punnett squares and a bit of a pedigree that result or show you how sickle cell happens. Now, with sickle cell anemia, people of African descent actually gain an advantage if they're carriers of the disorder or carriers of a gene for the disorder. So if we look here, where A is normal and S results in sickle cell anemia, or you being a carrier for sickle cell, for two people who are heterozygous, meaning they carry one normal and one abnormal gene, each time they have a child, they have a 25% chance of having a child who's fully normal, a 50% chance of having a child who carries the trait, and 25% chance of having a child who exhibits sickle cell anemia, which will cause sickling again of the blood cells, occlusion of the blood vessels, and generally pain in the limbs. Now that can be treated with blood transfusions or with bone marrow transplants. Now another erythrocyte disorder, a red blood cell disorder, that's really the opposite of the anemias are the polycythemias. And in these cases, where poly means many, cytocell, and emia is a blood condition, it's a condition where there are too many red blood cells, as you can see here in the slide on the right, as compared to the slide on the left. Polycythemia vera results usually from bone marrow cancers that produce excess numbers of red blood cells that may or may not be functional. Overall, that and secondary polycythemia will lead to an increase in blood viscosity or thickness, and thus make that person more prone to conditions such as stroke or clotting in the vessels. Secondary polycythemia can result from excess erythropoietin production or doping with EPO, or going to a high altitude where there's less oxygen available in the atmosphere, and thus the body picks up that availability or lack of availability of oxygen and thinks that you are in fact low in oxygen content and thus low in red blood cells. So now we'll consider the white blood cells, leukocytes. There are 5 primary types of white blood cells: the granulocytes, which contain granules of chemicals in them, neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, and the agranulocytes, or those that do not contain granules, the lymphocytes and the monocytes. So first we'll talk about neutrophils. Neutrophils are the most numerous of the white blood cells, and they tend to have these U-shaped purplish nuclei. And they contain some cytoplasmic granules that contain defensins, which are a type of enzyme that will form pores, or protein rather, that will form pores in bacteria, causing them to apoptose. By the process of diapetesis, they squeeze through spaces between the endothelial cells of capillaries and move into the areas of injured tissues or infected tissues, and generally they will phagocytize bacteria. The eosinophils, another type of granulocyte, look reddish when you look at them in the microscope using the 100x objective. They have a reddish looking nucleus according to the literature, but they will appear slightly reddish compared to the other ones. They're also phagocytic. They contain lysosomal enzymes and tend to go after parasitic infections. And one way to remember these is that parasites oftentimes have eggs. So remember eosinophils and parasitic worm eggs. They're also elevated in the cases of allergies and asthma. Basophils, which are the least numerous of all the white blood cells, are generally involved in allergies, asthma, hay fever, or anaphylactic reactions. And they contain granules that have histamine, a vasodilator, and serotonin, a vasoconstrictor, prostaglandins that incite inflammation, just like histamine, and leukotrienes that are part of the allergic response, which we'll discuss more with immunity. They're phagocytic and quite similar to mast cells in their origins and functions. Both mast cells and basophils originate from hemocytoblasts in the red bone marrow, and the big difference, according to the literature, is that basophils mature in the bone marrow, and mast cells, which you'd find in some of the dermis or the mucous membranes, mature once they're out in this general circulation. Now, lymphocytes are one of the two agranulocytes, meaning they don't have granules, and they'll look in the microscope as really just dark purple dots for you. They're fairly small, and there are two major varieties: B lymphocytes, which mature in bone marrow, thus their name, and T lymphocytes, which mature in the thymus gland, thus their name. They don't tend to circulate too much within the plasma, but are generally found in the lymph nodes and the spleen, where immunosurveillance or surveillance of the blood for antigens, foreign agents, occurs. The B cell's importance is that they generally differentiate into plasma cells, which are antibody factories or immunoglobulin factories, and the T cells usually direct the immune response, the adaptive immune response, one that responds to specific types of pathogens. So we'll talk more about these later when we discuss HIV and AIDS. And the monocytes are generally important when it comes to presenting antigens to T cells for understanding and direction of the immune response. They would be called APCs, or antigen presenting cells, and those antigen presenting cells are usually macrophages, or dendritic cells that are derivatives of monocytes. And on the right here you can see a dendritic cell, which has sort of these spiny extensions of its cytoplasm, much like a dendrite would. These are large phagocytic cells that tend to occur in the mucous membranes of the body, that would be in the alveoli of the lungs, the air sacs of the lungs, throughout the respiratory passages, and as dendritic cells or Langerhans cells in the dermis of the skin. So they're part of your first line of defense and take in really anything that's antigenic to you. They're also important in fighting intracellular bacteria, ones that have come into a cell, and chronic viral infections. So the formation of white blood cells stems from or comes from hemocytoblasts, just like red blood cells and platelets do, and we see two stem cell lines that form here. One are the myeloid cells, those that will mature in the bone marrow, and the other is the lymphoid cells, those that will mature or be developed in the lymphatic tissue, be most active in the lymphatic tissue. And if we follow those on down, we see that the lymphoid stem cells result in B and T lymphocytes, and the myeloid stem cells result in eosinophils, basophils, neutrophils, and monocytes. And this process is under the direction of interleukins and colony stimulating factors that stimulate the production of these white blood cell colonies. And white blood cells don't take quite as long as red blood cells to form, nor do they last quite as long. Generally, their life cycle is a few days to a couple of weeks. Question number 9. List the 5 types of white blood cells in order from most abundant to least abundant in blood plasma. 10. Name the 2 types of agranulocytes. And 11. Name the functions of neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. And here you see some blood that is leukemic, and in leukemia, it may be chronic or acute, meaning long-standing or coming about quite suddenly, myelogenous or lymphocytic, meaning deriving from the lymphocytes. Usually the chronic types occur in older people and the acute in children. Both of these conditions involve generally bone marrow transplants so that the person has proper bone marrow to do proper leukapheresis. So question number 12 is, what two groups of cytokines stimulate leukapheresis? And both of those groups are currently being used or studied as treatments for cancers. And lastly, here we see some manifestations of an Epstein-Barr virus, that's the EBV virus, which is most well known to cause infectious mononucleosis. And mononucleosis will usually cause splenomegaly, that's inflammation of the spleen or enlargement of the spleen, extreme fatigue and low-grade fevers, maybe a sore throat, but it does take on, as you can see here, several different manifestations depending on the state of immunity of the person who acquires the virus. And generally, the cure for mono is simply rest and relaxation. However, afterward, the person may need to limit sports, contact sports, so that there isn't rupture of the spleen, which is a highly vascular organ.